Hi, and welcome to Sitä Lab session where today we focus on social networks and social capital. And there's no better person to discuss these topics with me than our guest for today, who is Professor Nicholas Christakis. Thank you for sharing time with us today, Professor.
Thank you so much for having me, Jocko. Call me Nicholas.
A lot of our audience already knows who you are. They know your background and your research, but for those who aren't familiar with your background, can you give us a bit of an introduction of who you are and what is it that you do?
Well, I'm a scientist and a professor at Yale University. I run a lab called the Human Nature Lab that investigates the deep and fundamental origins and implications of specific parts of our human nature. I'm interested in our interactions with each other. How and why we have friends, how and why we're able to cooperate, how and why we love each other, how we form into groups and how those groups work. And so we do a lot of research on many different aspects of this, from the biology of it, to the application of it in public health domains around the world, to the implications for artificial intelligence. I mean, we do a broad sweep of research in this topic. And originally I was trained as a physician, and as a sociologist, and I've been a professor at Yale now for 10 years. Before that, I was at Harvard.
So you focus really on group behavior and interactions within groups, not that much on individuals, right?
No, not in particular. I mean, there are parts of human nature which individuals can express. For example, a particular individual we can try to understand why are some people more risk avid than other people, or religious experience. You know, why do we maybe have religious thoughts? You can have religious thoughts on your own, for example, or you can be brave. You know, some people are braver than others. You can be brave when you're facing a mountain that you have to climb, or a lion that wants to eat you, for example. Those are all individualistic parts of human nature. But I'm interested in those parts we express between ourselves. For example, love. You know, we're not so interested in whether you love yourself, or whether you are kind to yourself, or whether you are just to yourself. We're interested in whether you love others, or are kind to others, or are just to others. And so those are fundamental aspects of human experience that we necessarily must express with others. And the same goes more broadly for group dynamics. You can't cooperate with yourself. You have to cooperate with others. You can't coordinate with yourself. You have to coordinate with others. And so you can't, we say you can teach yourself something, but really that's not the real meaning of the word teach. You can't teach yourself something. You teach someone else something. So all of those things, cooperation, coordination, teaching, these are deep and fundamental aspects of human experience, which require groups to be realized, and which are at the core of how and why groups exist actually in our species, and how and why they are used to achieve collective and individual objectives. So that's what we're interested in. We're interested in groups. And by the way, just to give you another recent example, an epidemic is a group phenomenon. Yes, individuals get sick, but the epidemic has a collective property. You know, the speed with which a germ like COVID or SARS-CoV-2, the speed with which a pathogen like SARS-CoV-2, the cause of COVID, spreads through a population depends on how that population is structured. What is the network of interactions? And I can give you a very simple example of that by saying, well, imagine this population has no social connections, or imagine that this population, 100 people and there are no connections, or 100 people and everyone is connected to everyone else. So 100 times 99 divided by 2, nearly 5,000 connections. And you can easily imagine that the germ will spread much more rapidly in the latter population than the former. So this population structure affects the fate of the group and the fate of individuals. So all of those things are things we're interested in: collective expressions, how groups, the dynamics of groups and how they affect individuals and collectivities.
Yeah, so connections matter, the structure of the network matters, and we will actually come back to those later in the interview. For now, as a background for this interview, what we do in Sitä Lab is we do a lot of interventions where we aim to change the behavior of larger groups of people. And in those regards, I think that a good place where we might get started would be the concept of social capital. We would be interested in hearing your take on what does actually the concept of social capital mean, and why does it have such an importance when it comes to designing interventions that have a sociological aspect to them?
Well, first of all, it's very important to understand that there are certain properties of groups which can only be measured at the group level. For example, wealth is not one of those things. You can measure wealth at the individual level, and you can measure wealth at the group level, and you can speak of the wealth of an individual or the wealth of a group. But inequality is a different thing. You can't speak of the inequality of an individual. When you speak about income inequality, it's necessarily a group property, income inequality, right? You can say group wealth, individual wealth, but you say group inequality, but you can't say individual inequality. Or air pollution is another example. We all breathe the same air. So the changes in the air, the quality of the air affects all of us. It affects individuals, but it's a collective experience, the pollution of the air, income inequality. And social capital is like that. It's an intrinsic property of groups. Now, most people, when they think about capital, think about money. But really, actually, capital is any stock of resources that can be put to productive use. And two further key ideas about capital are that in order to create capital, you have to invest skill and effort. You have to know something and do something in order to create capital. And second, and more subtle, and in an idea that's been keeping me awake for 20 years, is that in order to create capital, you have to make changes in a substance that make it yield a higher rate of return than it otherwise would. In other words, you have to change the natural world, transform one thing into another thing, and that is at its core what the capital creation process is all about. For example, a farm is a stock of capital. By investing labor and skill and clearing a forest, we make a farm. And that farm is more productive than the forest. You're able to grow fruits and vegetables and grains and flowers and so on with a farm that you couldn't do with a forest. So you invest skill and effort, you transform one thing into another thing, and you make it a reservoir of wealth and a source of productive power. Or, for example, you can take a tree and you can mill it into lumber. And the lumber is more valuable than the tree because you can do things with the lumber you couldn't do with a tree, namely manipulate it some more and make a violin. And a violin is more valuable than the lumber because you can do things with a violin you couldn't do with a lumber, namely make music. So at every step of the way, you transform one thing into something else, and it makes it a reservoir of wealth and a source of productive power. Now, in the 1960s, social scientists began to think about human capital in this way. And the chief example is education. For example, you can take a person who maybe has addiction, and you can invest skill and effort and cure them of their addiction, and now they're more productive and able to do things they weren't previously able to do. And maybe then you invest still more skill and effort and you give them some training or an education. And now they're even more productive and capable of doing things they weren't able to do. You can work on the neurons of that person's mind. Like right now, when we're talking, in some sense, I'm changing your mind, right? I'm investing skill and effort, and I'm transforming your brain and making it more capable of doing something it wasn't capable of doing before. And this notion of human capital, entered the social sciences in the 1960s and has become widely adopted. Well, just like physical capital is a change in the material world, and human capital is a change in persons, social capital in organizations, in companies, in communities, in fact, in our whole society, is a change in the relationships among people, a change that renders that group more productive and capable of doing things it was not previously able to do. And that's the deepest account I can give you of actually how social organization, why we are organized socially, because we then have the capacity to do things that we weren't previously able to do. In fact, we evolved to have a particular organization, and how and why, in fact, we can use an insight into that organization to make the world better. So, for example, going back to my COVID example, in the two extreme cases of 100 people and no one is connected to anyone else, and 100 people and everyone is connected to everyone else, everyone immediately understood that that pattern of connections was relevant to the ability of the group to resist an epidemic. So it's not just about the immune function of each individual or the vaccination status of each individual. It's something about the collection of individuals, how they're organized, that affects the epidemic resistance of the population. And we can speak, therefore, of the resistance of an individual and the resistance of a group. And now you can imagine that every network structure between the null network, no connections, and the fully saturated network, all the connections, they're I was going to say infinitely, it's not infinite, but there's an extremely large number of possible arrangements of 100 people into networks. And you should have the intuition that different structures might affect the ability of that group to resist epidemics, to adopt recycling practices, to stop bullying in schools, to share accurate information, to avoid traffic jams. All of these things that are properties of groups depend on the structure of the groups. And that is a kind of social capital, something we all can access and that affects us all. Did I answer the question?
You did, and I feel like it's pretty kind of, if we compare human capital in the example of educating a person, it's pretty kind of easy to understand how that level of capital is kind of increased. But then when we go into social capital and we talk about kind of network structures, it's pretty much more difficult for myself to understand kind of how do we then develop that social capital, what can be done, how do we understand the structure of the network, and how should we develop? Is it safe to say that the way that the network should be structured depends on what we are looking for, what we are trying to do?
Yes, it does. And I can cultivate that intuition in you by another metaphor, which is the metaphor of carbon. So as we all learned in high school chemistry, carbon comes in a number of forms. For example, you can assemble the carbon atoms one way in sheets, and you get graphite, which is soft and dark. Or you take the same carbon atoms and assemble them another way in tetrahedrons, and you get diamond, which is hard and clear. And there are two key intellectual ideas there. First of all, these properties of softness and darkness and hardness and clearness are not properties of the carbon atoms, they're properties of the collection of carbon atoms. And second, which properties you get depends on how you connect the carbon atoms to each other. Connect them one way, you get graphite, soft and dark. Connect them another way, you get diamond, which is hard and clear. And it's the same with human groups. You can take a group of people and you connect them one way, and they are happy and innovative and wealthy and productive. And we've done many experiments to prove this, many experiments with thousands and thousands of people, which we've published. Or you take the same people and you connect them another way, and they are unhappy and unhealthy and unproductive and mean to each other. But the organization you want depends on the purpose. If you're trying to write a letter to your lover, you need graphite. If you're trying to give a gift to your lover, you need diamond. So the purpose is relevant. Same with human groups. The structure of a network that's optimal for a terrorist organization that's organizing a terrorist strike is completely different than the structure of a network of a military unit that is trying to defend itself. These are different organizations, are necessary for different collective purposes. So you're right, the manipulation of social capital depends in part on what our objective is. A kind of organization that resists in the spread of infections, for example, if we all stayed at home, that's a kind of social organization. And then if we all stay at home, that reduces the spread of a germ through a population. But that's not the right kind of organization to make people happy. So if you want to make people happy, you need a different organization. So which structure you adopt depends in part on your objective. And one more idea, the kind of the mathematical, the topological architecture, the mathematical structure of human social networks that we naturally make has been shaped by evolution. I talk about this in a book I wrote in 2019 called Blueprint: The Evolutionary Origins of a Good Society. And that's a book about how and why we evolved to live together in particular ways. Anyway, what you have to understand is that the way we naturally make friends, the fact that we have friends at all, which is very unusual in the animal kingdom. Every person listening to this takes it for granted that we have friends. But horses don't have friends, and crocodiles don't have friends, and jellyfish don't have friends. So we have friends. That's an interesting phenotype. We evolved to have friends. We evolved to have friends in particular ways. And then we give rise to particular kinds of networks with particular mathematical structures. And in some sense, those structures, the particular structures that we make, have had to balance across evolutionary time the risks and the benefits of social interaction. In other words, if I come near you, I can benefit by working with you to kill big game or to acquire food, or I can learn things from you. But also, if I come near you, you might steal from me, or you might kill me, or you might lie to me, or you might infect me with a germ. So there are both costs and benefits to social interaction, and our evolution has shaped our propensity to interaction to, on average, make it beneficial. So on average, the costs, the benefits of a connected life outweigh the costs. And very narrowly, you can imagine that the kind of network that's optimized for the spread of germs, the kind of network that's optimized to minimize the spread of germs, like a network that's disconnected, is the worst kind of network for the spread of ideas, right? But the kind of network that's optimized for the spread of ideas is a terrible network for the spread of germs. So in some sense, over time, evolution has counterbalanced these different costs and benefits. And in a very real way, the spread of germs is the price we pay for the spread of ideas. One of the reasons we make networks is to learn from each other. But when we make these networks to learn from each other, we then put ourselves at risk, not just for the spread of germs, but also for other bad things. Yeah. Anyway, that's a long answer, but I'm hoping I'm giving you, addressing your question.
And there are a lot of kind of ideas to tackle. I do have quite a few follow-up questions from there. When we talk about the structure of the network, what can we actually do to adjust the structure? I mean, in certain scenarios, for example, when we are working in an organization where we have some sort of a hierarchy or some sort of an organization that we can actually adjust, there I can see it. But then when we talk about, for example, civil society and a situation where we, for example, want to increase the amount of voters or democratic participation or something like that, what is there that people can actually do to intervene in a social system and to adjust it to one way or another?
So the answer to that is complicated. And we've done a lot of experiments with this in my lab, and I don't know whether we have the time to summarize them, but people can find the work we've done at humannaturelab.net. So www.humannaturelab.net, all our scientific publications are there. And I've written several books about different aspects of this if people are curious. So part of my answer is going to be nihilistic, in the sense that our innate capacity for friendship, our desire for friendship, our desire to copy other people, these are just as much a part of our evolutionary heritage as the way our kidneys work or the way our pancreas works. In other words, you can't pass a law that prohibits people from having friends, or you can't pass a law that says they have to now go from having 1 or 2 best friends to having 100 best friends. That's not how human nature works. So there are, on the one hand, limits to what we can do. On the other hand, there are policies we can enact that work consistent with human nature. And when they do that, they are better able to achieve certain policy objectives. those objectives, by the way, might be objectives you and I would agree with or not agree with. For example, you could use these ideas to sell people products they don't need, or you could use these ideas to get people to be more democratically engaged. So some of the things that work is, first of all, a set of ideas regarding social contagion, which is you sort of say the wiring diagram of the society is fixed, who's connected to who, but you manipulate the injection points where you introduce new information into the system. And by doing that carefully, you can optimize the flow of some desirable property. For example, we've done experiments in India. We just published a paper this past summer where we showed that we could increase the adoption of iron fortified salt to reduce childhood anemia, neonatal anemia, and maternal anemia by thoughtfully targeting particular individuals within the population based on where they were within the network. And we've done similar work in Honduras with support from the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation and the Nomis Foundation in Switzerland. We have done work mapping networks in villages in Honduras and showed how different sorts of public health ideas about vaccination and breastfeeding and so on can be made to spread within these villages. Another set of policies is not about manipulating contagion, it's about manipulating connection. And there are limits to what you can do in that regard. But even in that domain, think about things like, for example, Alcoholics Anonymous. Alcoholics Anonymous takes a group of strangers who didn't know each other, and it brings them together in a room and fosters connections between them. And in so doing, may contribute to sobriety, right? These individuals were less likely to be sober before, but now you bring them together and you make them sober. Or think about military training. You take a group of strangers who didn't know each other, didn't care at all about each other, and you form them into dense little companies of 10 men or women. And now those people are willing to die for each other. Previously, they couldn't care less. And now, because you've fostered these dense connections between them, you can elicit from them this new property. So there, but all of those examples, whether it's the spread of iron fortified salt or the elicitation from soldiers of a new willingness to sacrifice their lives and so on, all of those are working with natural human tendencies. They are exploiting existing propensities we have in order to foster some policy objective. So my answer to your question is policies that take into account the natural performance of human societies have a better chance of working than policies that somehow want to radically change human societies. And in Blueprint, I even look at this. I look at centuries of efforts. We have records going back thousands of years of groups of people who have said, we don't like how society is organized. We're going to go into the forest and make a new society. And it never works, right? They're never able to completely abandon basic aspects of our humanity that cannot be abrogated, maybe temporarily they can, but they cannot be forever.
Yeah. As for the final question, I wanted to know that in your labs, you do a lot of work with data and you have big data sets and you can model different types of networks and understand how they work. Oftentimes when we are planning social interventions, we don't have access to such data and we don't necessarily have the tools and methods to model a network and see how it works and simulate with it. Regardless, it feels necessary to somehow comprehend the network and the structure and what's going to happen when we do some sort of an intervention. So in cases where we don't have massive amounts of data or analysis tools, what can we actually do? What should we do to understand the network and how we should operate within that network?
Well, my lab over the last 10 years has been focused primarily on social contagion in large groups. And we do field experiments. We do experiments with thousands and thousands and thousands of people. The population we're working with in Honduras is 30,000 people. The population in India was 2,500 female heads of household. The populations in the experiments that we've done online are tens of thousands of people. Some experiments have involved millions of people. So I guess my answer to your question would be, even if you're doing whatever the policy intervention you're doing, it should be possible at least to do a small scale experiment where you have a treated group and an untreated group. And if you want, and then you study the outcomes. And if you want to understand the role of networks, it can help to map their network de novo. And we have some tools that my lab has released for public use. We have a network mapping tool called Trellis, which is available at trellis.yale.edu, trellis.yale.edu. And this can be used to map, for example, networks in schools or corporations or communities. It can also be used to map networks of isolated individuals. And that can give you some insight. So for example, we did a study a few years ago. We've done studies using Facebook data. We've done studies using phone data. Of course, these are intrinsic network data, but we've also done studies where we have asked people about their social connections and then followed up to see whether people say who with more self-reported connections, whether they are more or less likely to adopt an innovation, or whether if they adopt an innovation, they're more or less likely to influence their neighbors. So consider a recycling intervention, for example. Let's say you're trying, or a get out the vote intervention. You could imagine randomly assigning different blocks to different interventions. You could imagine surveying the people, say, I'm here at your door to encourage you to vote or encourage you to recycle. And while you're there, you could measure some things about these people using our tools or other tools. And then you come back and then you see what happened. And you might find that, and you could do this on a small scale, and you might find that that certain kinds of targeting or certain kinds of interventions are superior. So anyway, I don't know fully what the kind of work you're doing, but I have to believe that it's possible to evaluate it and to evaluate the role of networks in the impact, the social impact of what you're doing.
All right, thanks for the interview. I think we have a lot to think about and a lot of work still to do with networks. So thank you for joining us again, Professor Christakis. It has been a pleasure of mine.
Thank you so much for having me. Good luck with what you're doing.